You never know with Trump. Trump strikes up kind of warm relationships with all kinds of unusual people. The best example I can give you, Cathy, is the mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, Democratic Socialist. You know, in New York, Donald Trump's own city, the kind of person you think Donald Trump would absolutely hate. They seem to get on famously, like kind of houses on fire.
Andy Burnham's first speech as Labour leader made no mention of foreign policy, nothing on defence, nothing on national security. Keir Starmer seemed to revel in foreign affairs, but is it a blind spot for his successor? Let's hear now from Sir Peter Westmacott, former UK ambassador to the USA. Sir Peter, thanks very much for joining us here on Drive. How disappointed are you that there was nothing there on foreign or defence policy?
Well, hi, Cathy. Thanks for having me on. I'm not sure I'm totally disappointed because at the moment, I think that Angela very much an unknown quantity to most people outside the Labour Party. We don't yet know who he's going to have as his front bench team. We don't know who's going to be in the cabinet generally. He may be waiting until he has sought the approval of the king, as one is supposed to do as prime minister before you make these things public. And of course, he was becoming the leader of the Labour Party in advance of becoming prime minister. So I think we should allow a little bit of time to pass before we get too disappointed or indeed too excited about what we're hearing. That said, there was his policy speech, as you say, today, that was setting out a number of things he wanted to do. Hope was going to come back, decentralization, working class Britain was not going to be left behind anymore. You know, lots of important messages there. But you're right, nothing about security, nothing about foreign policy. Everybody has told him that this is going to be an important brief that he inherits from Keir Starmer. They've all told him that it was also an area where Keir Starmer found a certain relief, if you like, problems in domestic politics. And actually, I think in many ways he did well. You know, he was highly regarded for what he did on Ukraine. He was well received by a lot of the other heads of government around Europe and other parts of the world. And I think it was an area where people respected his diligence, his hard work, his integrity, and his attempt to do the right thing. So there are important shoes to fill on the foreign policy side. It's a gap in terms of what we've heard so far. On the other hand, you know, he's not somebody who's known to have had strong views on foreign and security policy until now. So perhaps we've just got to cut him a bit of slack, give him some time to let us know who he's going to appoint and what his policy priorities are going to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of talk of David Miliband, hasn't there? And I wonder if that would reassure people or not if he was appointed Foreign Secretary.
There was talk of David Miliband, and then it seemed to me that it sort of disappeared again. And we're hearing less about David Miliband, possibly because he's not in the House of Commons. He'd have to come back and be given a position in the House of Lords or be parachuted in, which is always politically controversial, and there isn't much time now. So I rather assumed, perhaps wrongly, that the David Miliband story has gone away. There's still Ed Miliband, there's still Yvette Cooper, who I'm sure would be happy to keep the job. There are a number of people.
There's a lot of talk of her keeping the job, isn't there? There is talk of that.
People will want to see, a highly experienced, competent woman still in the senior position, quite apart from Shabana Mahmood and others. So I just don't know. There are plenty of candidates who would like the job. And of course, the thing we have to be honest about with ourselves is that these days, the key foreign policy player, actually, apart from the Prime Minister, is the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's continuity there, yeah. It's interesting because in the sort of few hints we have got about foreign policy in the last few days, Andy Burnham said he'll not be afraid to disagree politely with the US President, Donald Trump. He's previously, though, called America's politics polarised and poisonous, so he's been much more outspoken. We heard from a spokesperson at the US State Department earlier in the programme saying, well, Donald Trump likes a good debate. How do you think he'd view it if Andy Burnham was a little bit more robust than Keir Starmer?
Keir Starmer, when he was first Prime Minister, obviously, and when Trump was first re-elected, obviously took a policy decision not to disagree with them in public, to lush him up. The state visit, the unprecedented second state visit, that famous photo op in the Oval Office, all that kind of stuff. But that card has been played. He's had his 2 state visits. There aren't going to be any more for Donald Trump. And also, I think there are quite a lot of people around Keir Starmer who felt that although we gave Trump more than what he wanted in terms of that unprecedented second state visit, there wasn't much payback. And so do we really need to be that acquiescent, if you like, in what we think Donald Trump wants, because an awful lot of other governments that have been very nice to him and sought understanding haven't had much in return. We've had the Greenland stuff, we've had rude remarks about wanting Canada, we've had tariffs, we've had problems with NATO, European Union. So I'm not sure that there's a political need to be any less robust, if you like, than Andy Burnham would want to be. And, been there, done that, if you like. The outgoing Prime Minister has played that card to the best of his ability. It worked pretty well for a while, but I'm not sure that you can do it again, and I'm not sure that Burnham will want to do it again. I think he will probably want to be, as they say, true to himself.
Well, Sir Peter Westmacott, thank you very much for joining us and giving us that analysis. Very interesting. Former UK ambassador to the USA, of course. Let's turn now to Admiral Lord West, the former First Sea Lord. Keir Starmer's left Andy Burnham with something of a black hole in defence spending. Alan, the fact that he didn't mention defence, did that ring alarm bells?
I mean, it really does ring alarm bells with me. We're running out of time because I'm afraid Keir Starmer didn't bite on the bullet and make the Chancellor find the money that was needed for defence. It's been sort of pushed on and pushed on. The world has completely changed. And even in the old world, it was changing slowly. We knew that defence was hollowed out. If you remember, the last Defence Secretary of the Conservatives said exactly that, Ben Wallace. Well, it's moving at a pace now, and our armed forces are really now in a very poor position. And a lot of money is needed, and it's more money than in the past. And saying, we've added a couple of billion, it doesn't cut the mustard. The chiefs of staff have made it very clear, as have a lot of people, that about 18 billion is required, and we need to get to this 3.5% figure by 2035, and we're not even going to get to the 3% by 2030. So Andy is going to have to take some action very quickly, and I don't think it's something that he feels comfortable with at all. And indeed, where on earth is the money going to come from? This is a whole nation issue. And the Russian... Sorry, let's carry on, Cathy.
No, I was just going to say, might there be an explanation? The fact that he didn't single out defence and foreign policy in his speech might be that he's continuing, as I was just discussing with Sir Peter there, that perhaps continuing with the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, continuing with Dan Jarvis at Defence, Jonathan Powell, National Security, and that might be reassuring that he's kind of going to let them get on with it as experienced people at that level in government, and he'll focus more on the domestic side. Does that wash?
Well, it's all very well focused on the domestic side, but Dan Jarvis actually has sold a pass in terms of saying exactly how much money is needed. And it is a really huge amount of money. But I'm afraid there's no alternative to it. As I say, our armed forces are in a dreadful state at the moment, but particularly because of current expenditure, in-year money, things like training, spares, all of these things. That's why we've got ships that can't go to sea. That's why we're not able to get aircraft up. That's why we've got soldiers who are not properly trained. We have not been in this position for a long time. So there's not only that, there's also the work needed to prepare ourselves for the new forms of warfare, which aren't totally different. I mean, the Treasury always think, oh, great, we'll have a drone and hybrid warfare. That means we don't have to spend money on anything else.
But maybe, Alan, there's all this talk of wealth taxes and other tax rises within the manifesto, of course. Perhaps that is where he's going to get the money for the defence investment plan. Perhaps that's the explanation.
Well, if that's what he's going to do, I'm delighted. If he gets the money, I'm absolutely delighted. But I have a fear.
Even if it means tax rises?
I think we have to do it because... we are in a very, very dangerous position, and time is running out. I mean, NATO and the Americans and others have all pointed out the dangers by about 2030, and in fact earlier than that, 2027. And yet we've got great holes in our defence, and that is very worrying. It is very worrying, and it means you need swift action. I have no problem with Andy handing over to someone who he feels really understands defence, but he's got to give them the wherewithal. And unlike Starmer, when he's convinced, which he should be, because everybody who knows about it knows we need that money, he has got to say to whoever his new Chancellor is, I'm sorry, I know life is very hard, but we have got to find this money, and I will have to explain it to the nation, because we're almost at war with Putin already in the grey zone. I mean, the attacks he's done on the cyber attacks, the attacks on trying to attack our undersea cables, using proxies to attack our critical national infrastructure. I mean, this is extraordinary behaviour. It's like it's war now, in a sense.
Alan West, thank you very much for joining us. That's Admiral Lord West, the former First Sea Lord there, with his take on the absence of defence and foreign policy in Andy Burnham's first speech since becoming Labour leader. Let's turn now to Gerard Baker, editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal, now to get his perspective on this foreign policy agenda. Good evening, Gerard.
Hello, Cathy.
You've heard Andy Burnham sort of hinting at a more robust approach to Donald Trump. How do you see that going?
With Trump, you never know, right? I mean, on the one hand, you would think Andy Burnham, again, from looking at the speech, reading what he said, everything we know about Andy Burnham, seemingly going to be a bit more left-wing, push the Labour Party, Britain a bit more to the left. You would not expect that to appeal to Donald Trump. As you say, he seems to suggest he's going to take a slightly less kind of
emollient,
diplomatic approach. Yeah, exactly, to Trump. And you would think all of that would go badly, but you never know with Trump. Trump strikes up kind of warm relationships with all kinds of unusual people. The best example I can give you, Cathy, is the mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, democratic socialist. In New York, Donald Trump's own city, the kind of person you think Donald Trump would absolutely hate. They seem to get on famously, like kind of houses on fire. So,
and a lot of it's about looks, isn't it? I mean, he might just think Andy Burnham's quite a good-looking guy, and therefore he can deal with him.
Probably does. Yeah, I mean, he loves Prince William. Keeps going on about how wonderfully handsome Prince William is. Let's not delve into the psychodramas going on inside Donald Trump's head there. But look, I think part of it is Donald Trump demands loyalty, right? And it's always one way. He never gives two-way loyalty. And so, look at the relationship with Giorgia Meloni. Giorgia Meloni was, really was flavour of the month when Donald Trump, came in. She, was a populist right-wing politician like him. They got on really, really well. Now they literally don't talk to each other because she said a few things that were kind of disobliging about what Trump was doing with Iran. So, look, I think Burnham would probably be well advised not to take the kind of slightly obsequious approach that perhaps with that, we all saw that famous moment you've just been talking about in the Oval Office when Starmer, pulled the state visit invitation out of his pocket. I think it would probably behove him to be a little bit more robust about that. But the key thing,
it's paid off for Giorgia Meloni domestically, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Look, Donald Trump does love Britain. I mean, he has, his mother was Scottish antecedents. He has, warm feelings for the British. He loves the royal family. So Burnham would be advised to kind of exploit that a little bit, maybe not be quite so obsequious as Starmer was, stand up a little bit. I'm sure that plays well at home, but, you never know. He could end up striking up an improbably good relationship with him.
I just want to mention two other stories, both very interesting. Trump's speech last night about threats to American democracy. Democrats suspect he's trying to sort of pave the way for calling the midterms a steal. What do you think?
It was a very strange speech because it contained lots of claims about elections that we've heard before that are not true, but it also did contain some slightly odd. A lot of it was directed at China and the way in which China, which we know does try and influence politics in democracies in the way that it behaves, and Russia did. And by the way, Trump acknowledged that Russia was involved in the 2020, trying to influence the 2020 election too. So it was an odd collection of grievances, some interesting new revelations about what countries had done. Yeah, you're right that there is concern about what happens with the midterms. We're 3 months away now from the midterms. There's concern that his claim that the elections aren't, the integrity of the elections is at risk, is being interpreted by some as saying that they won't accept the results or they may impose all kinds of restrictions. They're talking about, some people are fearful that there might be much tougher attempts to sort of filter out people from voting, to prevent them from voting. They are trying to pass legislation right now, the Republicans, some of them anyway, which would make it which would require, actually perfectly, many of them perfectly reasonable proposals, like requiring you to have ID before you vote. So, yeah, there's a legitimate amount of concern about what all this means. And I think the really interesting thing, though, Cathy, will be what happens after the election. If the Republicans lose narrowly, will Trump try and say, there was fraud, there was, skullduggery going on, and therefore some of these people who were elected should not be allowed to take their seats? That will be where things get potentially very, very uncomfortable.
And just finally and briefly, if you would, I've been talking to a State Department spokesperson about this idea of radical left-wing terrorism that Marco Rubio's been talking up. What do you make of that?
Look, I think the Biden administration and much of the, if you like, Western Europe and politics have been going on about right-wing terrorism for a very, very long time. White supremacists, they were considered the number one domestic threat here in the US. I think the Trump administration, I think that was always overdone. And I think the Trump administration is sort of trying to, counter that with claims about left-wing terrorism. It's there. We see it. We've seen it here in the United States. Lots and lots of, at least acts of political violence by left-wing groups. There are international groups that are probably being funded by some enemies of the United States that are doing that too. But look, it's good politics too for them to be saying the main threat to our stability, to our democracy, comes from the left and not from the right. So yeah, I'd expect to hear a lot more of that.
Interesting stuff. Gerard Baker, thank you very much for joining us. Fascinating as ever, and a great column today in the paper and online now, of course.